Hi everyone, welcome back to English 247, and this is for a class for Thursday, the 27th of June, where I wanted to continue discussing Emily Dickinson and begin to introduce the idea of incidents in the life of a slave girl. And I am in the midst of evaluating those papers that would have been submitted in to me after the stated due date. So I should get those back to you shortly if you haven't received your paper yet. And as you know, you all have the option of doing a revision. I just ask that you incorporate my comments into the revision, and certainly if you need further direction, please ask me, and I'll be happy to give you some further feedback. And that you hand in the original version with my commentary along with your new copy, your revision. You would have the higher of the two grades. And you have up until the ending of the semester in order to do so. And if you look below into our notes, you'll see our course outline as we are nearing the ending of our semester, that our semester ends on July 11th, which is a Thursday. This is when paper number 2 is due at 9 a.m., though certainly you can hand in paper number 2 earlier. And as you know, paper number 2 is very similar to paper number 1, the distinction being that you would be focusing on some of the later texts of the semester. So options could include Jane Eyre or even Dickinson, but writing about poetry is a very different kind of animal than writing about a novel or even a short story, though that is a possibility. And of course, the two texts that we are approaching to finish our semester, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and we are ultimately ending with The Awakening. And this is when I will be posting your final exam as well, Thursday the 11th, where I will have a series of essay questions and ask you to choose. And you would have approximately 24 hours or so to respond to that. I suggest that you devote about 2 hours or so to the essay, which is what you would do in a face-to-face class. But I will post the examination at 9 a.m. on Thursday, and it would be due by 9 a.m. the following day, which happens to be Friday. And again, I'm not expecting anything as well developed or as polished as what you would do at home, but you still should be able to synthesize ideas. It is an open book, open note exam, so you can reference course materials, and I encourage you to do so because the idea of the final is just basically pulling together everything that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And as you know, we've been talking about Emily Dickinson. And there are many reasons why she's such an important figure. If for no other reason, she's local in Amherst. So I think that just in terms of our understanding of our region, it's important to understand the significance of Dickinson's works. And I had you watch a autobiography, or a biography, I'm sorry, last class, that talked a little bit about Dickinson while also quoting a good amount of her poetry. It's one of the reasons why I like that biography. And your assignment for the attendance question for that day was to find a poem or even just a line that you found to be particularly compelling and to talk about the reasons why. And as you know, Dickinson has quite a large body of work, and I'm certainly not expecting you to read over 1,000 poems. But perhaps one of the poems that were discussed in the biography might have piqued your interest, or perhaps you have your own personal favorite. And I had also shared with you that you could just thumb through the Johnson edition, which is what I had ordered for our class if you are using print versions of the text. And as you would have learned in the documentary, the Johnson edition was the first edition to publish Emily Dickinson's poetry in the way that she intended, in the way that she wrote it, with the irregular capitalization and, more importantly, the use of the dash, which gives a completely different sense to her poetry. I also had given you a link through the Poetry Foundation. There are many links, but that link I thought was nice because it gave you a good sampling of some of her most famous poems. And I look forward to reading which poem or which line you happen to select. In terms of some of the lines of her poetry, which is how I have encouraged students to sort of think about Dickinson if you can't understand an entire poem. A very famous line that oftentimes is quoted at things like graduation ceremonies is, "I dwell in possibility." And what a powerful line that is when we think about dwell in terms of a home, but also dwell as in thinking and contemplating, even ruminating about something. And I think that this idea of dwelling in possibility and how ultimately a graduation ceremony is so well suited to thinking about how someone has devoted so much of their time to hope and possibility. Though my favorite line from Dickinson is, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted." One need not be a chamber to be haunted. An idea that I talk about in both my Gothic literature class, but also in my horror film class. Because as you know, that I am a fan of the Gothic and of horror. And some could say that Emily Dickinson's poetry is also rather dark in the way that the Gothic is dark. But I've never really believed that, in the sense that, yes, she does talk about dark themes such as death, but she portrays death in a rather positive way more often than not. And that was the poem that I wanted to discuss with you today because I selected one of my favorite poems to talk to you about. And this poem is "Because I Could Not Stop for Death." You might be familiar with this poem. It's oftentimes anthologized, or it's listed as number 479 in her poetry. And I think it exemplifies many of the elements we've come to associate with Emily Dickinson. First, it's a very personal poem, yet it also works on a universal level because death is the great question, the great unknown for all of us. And here we get death personified. This was not unusual for Emily Dickinson to personify inanimate objects. It's one of the ways that the capitalization works so well in her poem, because by capitalizing death, the word death, it portrays it as an entity. And this transition from the human world, which is very limited and very finite, to the spiritual world, which is quite limitless and infinite. And as the documentary talked about, I should say Emily Dickinson was very spiritual, but not necessarily religious in the sense of not going to organized religion. And perhaps what's most surprising about the poem as we get to the ending of it is that she is giving us this poem from the perspective in the afterworld. So she's already died. And there are religious allusions, and she oftentimes will even use the structure of religious hymnals in her poetry, which is also a way that she defied conventions of the time. So I wanted to read that poem to you, and you can see in the second section below that's labeled Dickinson, I've included a link to that poem as well. And you note that, or you could note that her poems don't have titles. Again, she wrote them for herself. So we refer to the first line, or we refer to it in its numerology based on the way that scholars have organized the poems. Some ways it reminds me of Shakespeare's sonnets. And the poem reads, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, no cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feel shorter than the day. I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity." Now, if we were to go through this poem stanza by stanza, and a stanza functions very much like a paragraph does in prose. So it's a section of poetry that's sectioned out that usually talks about one topic. And when we're reading poetry, we usually talk about explicating poetry, which sounds like the word explain, which is what we've been doing with literature. But particularly for something like poetry, what you're doing is analyzing line by line, word by word, piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation. And the shorter the poem, perhaps the more challenging, because everything has meaning or could have meaning. And we get at the beginning again this sense of the I, the very personal. I could not stop for death. None of us can stop for death because we don't decide when our time comes. Death decides for us, or at least that's the natural order of things. And notice how death is personified as an entity. And there's a long literary tradition of this, for instance, the Grim Reaper. I couldn't stop for death, so he kindly stopped for me. And again, long literary tradition of talking about death in the male, in the he, again, the Grim Reaper. And we don't usually think of the word kind in terms of death. But in this poem, she shows us how death can be kind because he offers us something that's much grander than our present world when we are alive. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. Long literary tradition of talking about life as a journey. And this idea of being in a carriage, obviously they wouldn't have been in a car in the 1800s, that holds just a very intimate moment, the deceased and death. And of course, what death offers is immortality, which is why death is kind. We slowly drove, he knew no haste. And there's no reason here to be concerned about time. Time is a human construct, and time is of the worldly. Is of the worldly world. It's not. It's of the living. It's not necessarily of eternity. And in eternity, there is no need for time because eternity is limitless. We slowly drove. He knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. Notice how at this point death has been called both kind and civil, and there isn't any need for labor or for work. Again, that's a human construct in the world. That wouldn't be something that would be in the afterlife. One might say that one appreciates the leisure that exists in the human world. But that said, we only need leisure because we have labor. When you don't have labor, you don't necessarily need leisure either. And we can see how they are getting further and further away from the human world to the spiritual world. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. And this is supposed to be symbolic of youth, the idea of children when they are in school. And at recess, the idea of fun, that's what recess is supposed to represent, in the ring. Though, if you are familiar with the term Ring Around the Rosie, which is what this poem is referencing, Ring Around the Rosie was specifically addressing, basically, disease and death. So, this was a constant in people's lives, tuberculosis. Or, even worse, the plague. Where children strove at recess in the ring, we passed the fields of gazing grain, and that's supposed to represent adulthood, gazing grain, farming. This is the world of work. We passed the setting sun, and that's supposed to represent old age and basically descent, the ending. Notice how you've got things like alliteration, the initial repetition of consonant sounds like gazing grain, which helps to give it a musical sense. And above all else, poetry is musical. Probably the most common way of thinking about poetry is thinking about song lyrics. They oftentimes share many commonalities. And then we go into the next stanza, or rather, he passed us, the sun is passing them as they continue moving on, again, leaving the human world to the spiritual. The dews drew quivering and chill, so now there's a change in temperature as well as the sun is setting. This is supposed to represent an ending of something. For only gossamer my gown, and gossamer is a very thin kind of fabric often associated with fairies. My tippet, which is a shawl. Only tulle, again a very thin fabric, oftentimes used for things like tutus, wedding veils, things of that nature. So, despite the fact that it's getting cold, she's wearing very thin clothing. And the idea is that cold and heat are also human constructs of the human world. You don't need to worry about that in the afterlife, nor do you even need to worry about clothing in the afterlife. Again, another human construct. We use clothing either for protection against the elements, again, something that would be of no concern in the afterlife, or we use it because of social convention, and again, that's not going to be a concern in the afterlife. We pause before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. So in other words, this house is so far away, it just seems like it's a swelling of the ground. Now, house is capitalized, and oftentimes nouns are capitalized in Emily Dickinson's writing. Of course, if you're capitalizing a noun, you're making it a proper noun, so one wonders what this house might be. It could perhaps be the house of God, perhaps a church. It could be a house in terms of a tomb or a mausoleum, because she is talking about the transition from the human world into the spiritual world. The roof, it was scarcely visible. That's how far away this house is. The cornice, which is an architectural element on the roof, in the ground. Again, this is how far this house is. It could even be literal, her literal home that they have passed by. There is a tradition oftentimes in funerals to take the deceased past their home, or what was once their home, before they are buried. And then, of course, the last stanza, which is so important. Since then, 'tis centuries. So this happened centuries ago. So this is somebody reflecting on the past. And yet it feels shorter than the day. Keep in mind, again, that time is a human construct. I first surmised the horses' heads were towards eternity. And of course, this could be literal. She's riding in a carriage, and the horses' heads are what she sees, and of course, they're bringing her to eternity. But this is also a biblical reference. If you are familiar with the four horsemen of the apocalypse and Armageddon, so she does make religious references throughout her poetry. So I must admit, one of the reasons why I like this poem is that I understand it, and I don't always understand all of her poetry. And as we saw in the documentary, neither do the scholars. She tries to articulate emotions, and that's not an easy thing to do. Certainly, if you've ever felt an emotion, you know how complex they can be. I think she is a poet that has a great ability of putting language to emotional states. And one of the reasons why she is so respected and esteemed. And so important during this time period. As we began the semester, we talked about the cult of true womanhood. And we know how Emily Dickinson, just in terms of her life choices, defied the societal conventions of the time. And certainly she did the same with her writing as well. So, in terms of moving on, perhaps the most important text of the semester is the text that is least known, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And I could say that I didn't know about this text until I began teaching women in literature class, which I find to be absolutely horrible. I was never taught about this in a history class. Many of my students have said the same thing, that they've never been taught this in a history class or in a literature class. And it's so incredibly important. And while certainly we can admire the female voices of Mary Shelley or Charlotte Bronte or Jane Austen, they all come from a position of comfort and privilege as Caucasian women in a way that Harriet Jacobs does not. And it's almost easy to believe that slavery were not occurring during this time period based on the way these writers were writing. Now, Harriet Jacobs used a pseudonym for this, Linda Brant. I wonder if it's a distancing technique, because the telling of her true story is just so brutal and so traumatic, and I can only imagine how triggering. If you know Spanish, you know that Linda means linda or pretty. I think that's very deliberate. And while Linda Brant was taught to read and write, which was very unusual for a slave at the time, which gets us back to the idea of the cult of true womanhood and the danger that books could impose upon society. This is one of the many reasons why slaves are not taught to read and write, because education is power, and power allows you to question the systems in place and perhaps even overthrow them. Um, but despite the fact that the writing of this text is perhaps not as literary as some of the texts we've read earlier, there are still literary elements, starting with names. And I think Linda is a very deliberate choice in terms of his associations with beautiful. And we do have a slave narrative from a female perspective, which makes it very rare. We are basically shown and told about many, but not all, of the hardships associated for slavery, and the call for reform, especially to women of the time period, who oftentimes were also disenfranchised and also had a lack of power, but certainly not to the extent of a slave. That's also embedded in the 19th century sentimental novel, and perhaps that increased readership, where you've got a story about decorum and virginity and virtue under siege. I can't help but think of Jane Eyre and how oftentimes it's talked about in terms of the romance between Jane and Rochester, but there's so much more to the novel than that, but that might have encouraged readership. Just like I wonder if Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was such a male-centric world, because again, that might have encouraged readership. And Linda Brent is very clear about her motivations to write. She wants to educate. She wants to spur reform. And scholars have determined that this was indeed a true story, even though it seems impossible. And what we see are instances of both passive and active resistance. It's something you might say that we've seen all semester long. And how does one remain true to oneself while maintaining their self-respect? We definitely get a story of female bonding. We saw a little bit about this when we were talking about Anne and Persuasion with Mrs. Smith, for instance, and certainly Lady Russell. Perhaps we saw a little bit more about this when Jane Eyre was talking about Miss Temple, or perhaps Helen Burns. But the idea of the grandmother and the importance of the grandmother and taking the mother role for Linda Brent or Harriet Jacobs is so significant in this novel. And again, these seemingly impossible events for living for years in a garret have been verified by scholarship. The strength of the human will. This is both a sweet tale and the importance of being able to maintain dignity and family and just to survive, but also a very bitter tale about the deprivations and the hardships that one can undergo and the cruelty that one human can impose on another. And once again, we see what it means to be a woman in a male society, but we also see what it's like to be a slave in a free society and what it's like to be black in a white society. From, of course, Linda Brent's perspective. She was born a slave in North Carolina and talks about that she didn't realize even that she was a slave until her, quote, kind, unquote, mistress died, and bequeathed her, rather than setting her free, to the mistress's 5-year-old niece, Emily Flint. We've talked about how female was oftentimes viewed as a kind of possession. After all, Victor and Frankenstein was given Elizabeth as a kind of gift. But this is a whole different level of ownership and possession when we talk about slavery. And of course, a 5-year-old isn't capable of having the responsibility associated with slave ownership, which meant that her father, Dr. Flint, was going to be responsible until his daughter, Emily, came of age. And this is when ultimately we see how Dr. Flint takes advantage of Linda Flint, and how many slave owners took advantage not only of their slaves, but particularly their female slaves. And of course, she's using pseudonyms again to protect the identities of individuals, but Flint is something that's very hard and jagged and steely, which I think very much illustrates his personality. And much of the novel is about sexual pursuit and the additional difficulties female slaves would be subject to because of the threat of rape, which was the particular lot of female slaves. And Linda's strength and her cleverness to avoid being raped by Mr. Flint and her ability to confront him. I mean, she says right out, "How I despise you," in chapter 7. This could be something that could result in death. We had talked about the idea of Jane Eyre being so strong as a child and, standing up to her aunt, but that's fiction. This is reality. We learn a little bit about the dilemma of the child slave through William, which happens to be Linda's brother. Do you follow your father, or do you follow a slave master? And William says something I think that's quite telling in chapter 4. William did not mind the smart of a whip. He didn't like the idea of being whipped, the principle of what it meant to be a slave and not to be seen as human. And of course, we know that Linda is in an impossible situation, so she decides to choose her own lover, and that's Mr. Sands. And Mr. Sands, I think, is also a wonderful name because sand is not firm, it's shifty, it's transitory, which is something that we see in his character throughout the novel. He continues to promise Linda that he will grant her freedom, or he will buy her freedom, and he doesn't do so. And of course, Linda becomes pregnant. And ultimately slaves follow the lot of the mother. Mr. Sands becomes more and more important in society, and even has a political career, but that doesn't mean that he has any kind of responsibility to the children that he has with Linda Brent. Linda and the grandmother are very different women. While the grandmother accepts her fate, very religious, and says that it's the will of God, it almost reminds me of Justine in some respects with Frankenstein. Linda rebels. And this is what we've been seeing over the semester in varying degrees about rebellious women. 7 years Linda Brent spent in that garret that was 9 feet long and 7 feet wide. So if this were a face-to-face class, I would ask for the tallest person in class. Usually that's someone around 6 feet, give or take a little bit. And I would have them stand just to give you an idea of perspective of what 7 feet wide might be, or 9 feet long. And it's a very small space. And of course, she's entrapped, but yet she's also free. Because she's able to maintain her independence from her slave master. And what is freedom and what is slavery? And is it a state of mind as much as a state of physicality? Those are the questions that are embedded within the text. And I hope I'm not giving away spoilers at this point, that you finish the text, but we won't finish the text itself until our next class and then begin with the awakening. Of course, in chapter 15, one of the things that Dr. Flint says to Linda, and again, he's a doctor, one would expect that with his social status that he would have a superiority of behavior, and we see that's the exact opposite. Linda, you desire freedom for yourself and your children. You can only obtain it through me. And we basically see how that's a lie, because Linda finds a way to obtain her own freedom. Not because of Dr. Flint, but in spite of him. At age 40, Linda is ultimately purchased, which is still mind-blowing that a human being could be purchased by a Mrs. Bruce and given a freedom. And of course, Linda talks about how grateful she is about that, but also how unsavory that is, that a human needs to be purchased and granted freedom. The episodes in this reading are not easy. We see lots of physical and mental abuse, brutality, cruelty, hardship, degradation, persecution. Again, I'm astonished about the level of cruelty that one human can impose upon another. And a lot of hypocrisy. And that's also been a theme that we've talked about throughout the entire semester, is hypocrisy. That's going to be today's attendance question, by the way, for incidents in the life of a slave girl, which I'll get to in a moment. But we see hypocrisy firsthand in politics and religion and society as a whole. And at one point, Linda Brent urges white women who only feel jealousy and rage over their slaves because they know that their husbands are going to be sexually attracted to the slaves and might act upon those urges, to rise up. And the idea of, if every disenfranchised group were to work together rather than separately, they would have much more power against the oppressor. And it's something that is still relevant in today's time. we see how she tries to educate us about some of the elements of slavery and also spur reform. So you may or may not have known that on New Year's Day auctions were held, and this is where families were split up. And the consequences still exist into our present time when we talk about absent black fathers and how black fathers really weren't allowed the ability to raise their children and to be the heads of households. And we are still suffering the consequences of that today. The inability to choose one's mate. And it's one thing when we are in persuasion and Anne is persuaded against choosing her mate, and it's quite another when Linda finds a mate and is denied by Dr. Flint and finds that her only option is to choose someone who is perhaps better, at least on some level, than Dr. Flint, or at least someone that she has some attraction towards. It's an impossible choice in an impossible situation. You may or may not know that free black men, quote, free, unquote, were given the privilege of earning their own wages, some of which they had to relinquish. And they oftentimes were trying to, quote, buy, unquote, their family's freedom. You may or may not have known the number of people in slavery who prayed to die, particularly women, because they understood that they would be used for birthing, basically cattle, and what that would mean to their offspring. You may or may not have known about the muster, and this was a place for, and I'll read you a quote, an opportunity for the low whites who had no, quote, Negroes, unquote, to scourge, to show their subserviency to slaveholders, not reflecting that the power which trampled on the colored people also kept themselves in poverty, ignorance, and moral degradation. The one time where poor whites were able to basically exercise their power by showing their superiority to slaves, by being basically able to take anything that they wanted. But of course, they never questioned the other days of the year where the economic slavery has kept them enslaved. As I had indicated before, that the slave's lot follows that of the mother. How often slaves needed to be wet nurses to white children. So even though slaves were seen as inferior, they were basically supposed to breastfeed the offspring of their white masters. Again, talk about a contradiction or an element of hypocrisy. The fugitive slave law, where if a slave were to escape to a, quote, free, unquote, state, they could be brought back against their will to their original state where slavery was legal. Or the fact that, and I think we know this on an intellectual level, but being able to see it during this time period, that racism was alive and well in both the North and the South. Certainly there were distinctions between open slavery in the South and perhaps a more subtle level of slavery or discrimination in the North. But obviously we still see the repercussions of that in our own society. In chapter 9, there's a line that I think is just brilliant from a literary perspective. Again, not necessarily a literary work, and yet we see so many literary elements within it. When Linda Brent says, or Harriet Jacobs, I was 21 years in that cage of obscene birds. Cage of obscene birds is such an incredibly powerful image. And so I think well done from a writing standpoint. And a commentary on chapter 35, finding that I was resolved to stand up for my rights. This is when Linda's been able to make it to the North. They concluded to treat me well, but some poor creatures have been so brutalized that they'll sneak out of the way to give their masters free access to their wives and their daughters. That's something that's also discussed in chapter 8. So these are just a few of the things to consider if you've already read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or if you are in the midst of reading Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or if you have to read Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I encourage you to start now, because our discussion forum question will be due on Saturday the 29th. Certainly if you need a little bit of additional time, you can ask me for an extension. But as you can see, we are coming close to the ending of the semester. And while you're not required to respond to your classmates' responses, you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. And that'll give you a good idea of some of the elements of the text that I haven't discussed thus far, particularly in regards to hypocrisy, which is what our attendance question is going to be. What do you think is one of the most hypocritical acts and incidents in the life of a slave girl? And explain why. Once again, there's no right or wrong answer. I'm more interested in your reasoning than anything else. But reading everyone's responses and their reasoning should give you a good idea of some of the major elements of the book, which we will put some closure to and begin the awakening next class. And then, of course, next Thursday is the 4th of July. So we wouldn't be having a class. I hope you can devote some of that time to perhaps working on paper number 2 or a revision if you so elect to do so, because our last class is on the 11th. That is a Thursday, and your paper number 2 will be due at 9 a.m. on that day, which is when I will be posting the final exam, so that you can take the final exam free and clear without any distractions, so that you can submit in the final the following day, which is the 12th, at 9 a.m. That would give you 24 hours for an exam that should take approximately 2 hours. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, putting some closure onto incidents in the life of a slave girl and discussing the awakening. Take care. Bye-bye.